My stepbrother moved into my garage 6 months ago, and last week he served me with eviction papers for my own house, claiming he's established tenancy. Started when my mom married his dad 10 years ago. Jason was 25, living at home, working part-time at a vape shop. I was 22, in law school, working 2 jobs to pay tuition. He immediately hated that I was younger but further ahead in life. When I graduated law school and got hired at a property management firm, Jason said I only got the job because I was a woman. They need diversity hires, he told everyone at my graduation party. Real estate is easy when you're filling quotas. I specialized in tenant law and evictions. The irony wasn't lost on me when he called 6 months ago begging for a place to crash. Just for a few weeks, he promised, until I get my business off the ground. His business was now cryptocurrency trading. He'd lost $3,000 in the first month. I said no initially, but my mom called crying. He's family. He's struggling. You have that big house all to yourself. The house I'd bought with my own money after 5 years of working 70-hour weeks. Let him stay in the garage, she pleaded. He'll convert it to a living space. Add value to your property. Against every instinct, I agreed. Jason moved in with a truck full of garbage bags and promises to be the best roommate ever. He'd pay rent, help with maintenance, be quiet and respectful. The rent never came. Business is slow this month, became his monthly excuse. The garage conversion was just him hanging sheets from the ceiling and plugging in a space heater that tripled my electric bill. He had people over constantly, called them business meetings, but they were just other unemployed guys playing video games until 3 a.m. When I complained, he said I was stifling his networking. Month 3, he started using my kitchen because the garage didn't have one. Fair enough, except he never cleaned, never bought groceries, just ate my food and left dishes everywhere. I'll get groceries next week, he'd say, then show up with a bag of chips and call it even. Month 4, he was showering inside because the garage was too cold, using my washer and dryer. Just during business hours, he said. His business hours were apparently noon to midnight. Month 5, he started telling people he was a co-owner of the house. I heard him on a date call saying, "Yeah, I own property." Well, co-own. It's complicated. It wasn't complicated. His name wasn't on anything. Last week, everything changed. I came home to find an eviction notice taped to my own front door. Jason was standing there smirking. "What is this?" I asked. 30-day notice to vacate, he said. I've established residency and I'm claiming the property under adverse possession laws. That's not how adverse possession works. I've been here 6 months. I've improved the property. I have mail coming here. You accepted rent from me. You never paid rent. You accepted the promise of rent. That establishes a landlord-tenant relationship. But since I've also made improvements and you've been absent from the property during work hours, I'm claiming primary residency. I work? That's not abandonment. My lawyer says different. Jason, I'm a property lawyer. This is nonsense. Is it? I've documented everything. The improvements I've made, the times you've been gone, the verbal agreements we've had. You can fight it, but that'll take months. Courts favor sitting tenants. Easier to just leave. Leave my own house? I need it more. You're single, no kids. I'm trying to build a business, create jobs, contribute to the economy. This house is holding you back anyway. Too much responsibility for someone your age. I was 32. He was 35 living in my garage. You have 72 hours to respond, he said. I'd start packing. I went inside, called my mentor from the firm. She laughed for 5 straight minutes. He's trying to adverse possess a house he's lived in for 6 months? He thinks he's clever. Show him clever. I spent the next day pulling documents. The deed in my name only. Every utility bill I'd paid. My mortgage statements. Property tax receipts. Then the fun stuff. Security footage from my doorbell camera showing Jason entering as a guest. Text messages where he begged to stay temporarily. The lease agreement I'd drawn up that he'd refused to sign because family doesn't need contracts. His social media posts thanking me for letting him crash. Screenshots of him admitting to friends that he was broke and homeless. Day 3, I served him with my own papers. Real ones. Notice to quit for a month-to-month guest with no tenancy rights. Itemized bill for 6 months of utilities. Cease and desist for fraud and harassment. Criminal trespassing warning for the main house he'd been entering without permission. And my favorite, a lawsuit for damage to property and intentional infliction of emotional distress. His fake lawyer turned out to be some guy who'd taken one online legal course and charged desperate people for terrible advice. When Jason called him, he said to comply immediately, or face criminal charges. Jason stood in my doorway holding all the papers crying. He kept saying he didn't know I was serious and that his lawyer promised this would work. I told him he had 24 hours to remove everything from the garage or I'd have it all put on the curb. He started stammering about needing more time and not having anywhere to go. I closed the door in his face while he was still talking. Through the window, I watched him stand there for another 5 minutes holding those papers before he finally walked back to the garage. My hands were shaking, but it felt good to finally draw a hard line after 6 months of his garbage. That night around 9, my phone rang with Jason's number. I didn't answer. He called 3 more times, then gave up. At 11 p.m., my phone rang again with Mom's name on the screen. I almost didn't answer, but I knew she'd just keep calling. She was crying before I even said hello. Jason had called her sobbing about how mean I was being, and how I was making him homeless over a simple misunderstanding. She demanded I give him another chance because family doesn't treat family this way. I reminded her that family also doesn't try to steal each other's houses with fake legal papers. She said I was being dramatic, and Jason was just confused about tenant rights. I told her Jason knew exactly what he was doing when he filed fraudulent documents and tried to evict me from my own property. She hung up on me. I didn't sleep much that night. The next morning, I called work and took a personal day. I found a locksmith who could come out immediately and paid extra for the rush service. He changed the lock on my front door first, then the back door, then the side door I barely used. The door between the garage and the main house had been Jason's constant entry point, so I had that one changed too. The locksmith suggested a proper deadbolt on the garage exterior door since the existing lock was cheap and easy to pick. I agreed and kept the only key. The whole process took 3 hours and cost me $400, but it was worth every penny. I tested each lock twice to make sure they worked smoothly. Around noon, I heard a truck pull up outside. I looked through the window and saw Jason climbing out of a beat-up moving truck that was probably borrowed from one of his unemployed gaming friends. He tried his old key in the garage door and looked confused when it didn't work. Then he noticed the new deadbolt and his face turned red. He pulled out his phone and I could see him typing angrily. My phone buzzed with a text asking what I'd done to the lock. I didn't respond. He tried calling, but I declined it. After a few minutes, he gave up and started loading his stuff into the truck. All those garbage bags of clothes went in first. Then his gaming setup with the massive monitor and tangled cables. His friend's ratty couch that had been taking up half the garage. The space heater he'd been running constantly on my electric bill. He kept shooting angry looks toward my window, but he didn't try to come to the door. I figured Neville Ferguson must have explained what fraud charges would mean because Jason was being surprisingly compliant. The loading took about 2 hours. I watched the whole thing to make sure he actually left and didn't try to sneak anything into my main house. When the truck finally pulled away, I felt this huge weight lift off my shoulders. I waited 10 minutes to make sure he wasn't coming back, then went out to inspect the garage. The space heater was smashed on the floor with the cord ripped out. There were holes punched in the drywall at fist height. His sheets that had been hanging as room dividers were torn down and left in a heap. The mini fridge he'd brought was unplugged and sitting in a puddle of spoiled food water. Petty revenge from someone who couldn't handle consequences. I took photos of everything with my phone, making sure to get clear shots of each damaged area. Then I added it all to my lawsuit documentation and called 3 contractors for repair estimates. The cheapest quote came back at $1,200. That evening, I was making dinner when someone knocked on my door. I looked through the peephole and saw Mom standing there with my stepdad behind her. He looked tired and embarrassed. I opened the door but didn't invite them in. Mom immediately started demanding to know where Jason was supposed to go now that I'd kicked him out. I told her he could go back to their house where he'd lived before imposing on me for 6 months. She got this weird look on her face and glanced back at my stepdad. He wouldn't meet my eyes. That's when she admitted they'd downsized to a 1-bedroom condo last year. The house where Jason grew up had been too much for them to maintain. They'd sold it and moved into something smaller and cheaper. She'd been desperate for me to take Jason in because they literally didn't have space for him anymore. She'd manipulated me into solving her problem without being honest about why it was so urgent. I felt this cold anger settle in my chest. I told her to leave. She started crying and saying I was being unreasonable. My stepdad put his hand on her shoulder and quietly said they should go. I closed the door and locked it. The next day, Laura called to check on me. She'd heard through the property management legal community that Jason had actually tried to evict me using adverse possession after 6 months. Word had spread fast because it was such a ridiculous claim. Several attorneys wanted to use it as a teaching example of what not to do in tenant law courses. The absurdity of it made me laugh for the first time in days. Laura said I'd handled it perfectly, and she was proud of how I'd documented everything. I spent the weekend deep cleaning my entire house. Every surface Jason had touched got scrubbed down. I threw out all the food he'd eaten from, even the stuff that was still sealed. The dishes he'd used went in the trash because I didn't want them anymore. I bought new towels to replace the ones he'd used. New hand soap for the bathroom. I rearranged furniture in the living room so it didn't look the same as when he'd been crashing on my couch during his so-called business hours. By Sunday night, my house finally felt like mine again. Monday morning, I was back at my desk going through emails when my phone rang with an unknown number. I almost didn't answer, but something made me pick up. The man identified himself as Gerard Cantu, a real estate attorney who'd heard about my case from Laura. He asked if I'd checked whether Jason had filed any fraudulent documents with the county recorder's office claiming interest in my property. The question hit me like ice water. I hadn't even thought about that. I thanked Gerard and hung up, then pulled up the county property records website on my work computer. My hands shook as I typed in my address. The page loaded, and there it was. A deed filed 2 weeks ago showing Jason had purchased a 50% interest in my house for $1. The filing date was right after I'd told him he couldn't use my kitchen anymore. He'd planned this. The fake eviction notice was just the distraction while he tried to steal my house through fraud. I grabbed my purse and ran to my car. The county recorder's office was 20 minutes away, but I made it in 12. I burst through the door with my folder of original documents and asked for help at the front desk. The clerk took one look at my face and brought me to a supervisor. I spread everything across the counter. My deed with my name only. My mortgage statements. The fraudulent filing showing Jason's fake purchase. The supervisor's eyes went wide as she compared the documents. She immediately flagged Jason's filing as fraudulent in the system and printed me a copy of the flag. But then she explained the bad news. The fraudulent deed was already recorded in the public record. Even though it was flagged, the cloud on my title existed. I'd need a court order to void it completely and clear my ownership. Any title search would show Jason's claim until a judge officially removed it. I couldn't sell or refinance until this was fixed. Jason had damaged my property rights even though his fraud was obvious. I called Gerard from the parking lot and explained everything. He said he'd handle the title clearing pro bono because cases this bad offended him professionally. He asked me to scan and email all my documents, then said he'd file an emergency motion to void the fraudulent deed by end of business. He also said he was adding criminal fraud charges to the complaint because filing false property documents was a felony. Jason wasn't just facing a civil lawsuit anymore. He was looking at potential prison time. I drove back to work feeling sick. How far had Jason planned to take this? What else had he filed that I didn't know about? I got back to my desk and tried to focus on actual work, but my phone kept buzzing with emails from Gerard. He'd already drafted the emergency motion and was filing it electronically. He'd also contacted the district attorney's office about the criminal fraud. By 3 that afternoon, a courier delivered a letter to my office. It was from a law firm I'd never heard of, requesting a meeting to discuss settlement of the dispute between Jason and myself. The letter was professionally written, nothing like the garbage Neville had produced. This was a real lawyer. The letter tried to frame Jason as confused and misled by bad legal advice from an unlicensed consultant. It suggested Jason hadn't understood the legal implications of his actions and wanted to resolve everything amicably. I read it twice and felt my anger build. Jason knew exactly what he was doing when he filed that fake deed. He'd researched how to do it. He'd filled out the forms. He'd paid the filing fee. This wasn't confusion. This was calculated fraud. I forwarded the letter to Gerard and asked when we could meet with this lawyer. He replied within minutes saying his office tomorrow at 10. The next morning I arrived at Gerard's office 15 minutes early. It was in a nice building downtown with actual artwork in the lobby. His assistant brought me coffee and showed me to a conference room with a long table and leather chairs. Gerard arrived with a banker's box full of documents. Jason's lawyer showed up right at 10. She was younger than I expected, maybe early 30s, wearing an expensive suit. She introduced herself and immediately started talking about how we could resolve this unfortunate misunderstanding. Gerard let her talk for about 2 minutes. Then he opened the banker's box. He laid out the fraudulent deed Jason had filed. The fake eviction notice Jason had taped to my door. Photos of the property damage in the garage. The itemized bill for 6 months of unpaid rent and utilities totaling over $8,000. Text messages where Jason admitted he was broke. Social media posts where Jason thanked me for letting him crash temporarily. Security footage showing Jason entering my house as a guest. The lease agreement Jason had refused to sign. Every piece of evidence organized in clear plastic sleeves with tabs. Jason's lawyer's face changed as Gerard methodically presented each document. Her professional smile disappeared. She started taking notes frantically. When Gerard finished, she asked to make a phone call. We waited in the conference room while she stepped into the hallway. Through the glass door, I could see her pacing and talking on her phone. Her free hand kept gesturing angrily. She was on the call for almost 10 minutes. When she came back, her whole attitude had shifted. She looked directly at me and apologized. She said her client had lied to her about the situation. He'd told her I'd verbally agreed to sell him half the house and then backed out. He'd shown her fake text messages supporting his story. She'd taken the case believing he was a victim of a family dispute over a property agreement. Now she understood he'd committed fraud against both me and the legal system while lying to his own attorney. She was withdrawing from representing him immediately and would be reporting his conduct to the state bar. Gerard thanked her for her professionalism. She gathered her things and left without another word. Gerard looked at me and said Jason was in serious trouble now. Lying to your own lawyer was one of the stupidest things you could do. No reputable attorney would touch his case after this. 2 days later, I was at my desk reviewing a lease agreement when my assistant buzzed me. She said there was someone in the lobby asking to see me, but he wasn't on my calendar. Before I could ask who, she added that he seemed upset and was insisting it was urgent. I had a bad feeling. I walked to the lobby and found Jason standing there in wrinkled clothes. He looked like he hadn't slept. He started toward me saying we needed to talk. I backed up and told him to leave. He kept coming, saying I was ruining his life over a misunderstanding. I turned and walked quickly toward the security desk. The guard stood up as Jason followed me, his voice getting louder. I explained to the guard that this man was harassing me and I wanted him removed from the building. Jason started yelling that I was his sister and I couldn't do this to family. The guard called for backup and 2 more security officers appeared. They escorted Jason out while he shouted about how I'd regret this. My boss came out of her office and asked what happened. I explained the whole situation, the fake deed, the eviction attempt, everything. She listened carefully and then said I should get a restraining order. I hadn't thought of that, but it made perfect sense. Jason was escalating. First the legal fraud, now showing up at my workplace. What would he do next? I left work early and drove straight to the courthouse. The clerk gave me the paperwork for a temporary restraining order and I filled it out in the waiting area. I documented Jason's fraudulent legal claims, his appearance at my workplace that morning, the threatening text messages he'd been sending about how I'd regret ruining his life. I attached copies of everything Gerard had compiled. The clerk reviewed my application and sent me to see a judge. The judge read through my documentation and asked a few questions. How long had Jason lived with me? Had he ever been violent? What was my relationship to him? I answered everything honestly. The judge granted the temporary restraining order immediately and set a hearing for a permanent order in 2 weeks. Jason had to stay at least 500 feet away from me, my home, and my workplace. Violating the order would result in immediate arrest. I left the courthouse with certified copies of the order. I felt safer but also guilty. This was my stepbrother. Mom was going to lose her mind. I got home and had maybe an hour of peace before my phone rang. Mom. I almost didn't answer, but I knew I had to eventually. I picked up and she was already crying. She'd heard about the restraining order from Jason. She said I was tearing the family apart. Jason was living in his car because no one would take him in. How could I do this to him? I took a deep breath and told her the truth. Jason tore the family apart when he tried to steal my house. He filed fraudulent legal documents. He showed up at my workplace harassing me. His homelessness was a consequence of his own choices, not my responsibility. She started yelling that I was heartless. That family helped family no matter what. That I'd always thought I was better than everyone else. I told her I had to go and hung up. My phone rang again immediately. I ignored it. It rang 4 more times before finally stopping. 10 minutes later, my phone rang with my stepdad's number. I answered cautiously. His voice was quiet and sad. He said he wanted to apologize for Mom's behavior. He'd been trying to get Jason to take responsibility for years, but Mom always made excuses for him. He said he was proud of me for standing up to both Jason and Mom's enabling. He hoped this would finally force Jason to grow up, though he wasn't optimistic. We talked for a few more minutes. He asked if I was okay, and I admitted I felt terrible despite knowing I'd done the right thing. He said that was normal, and it proved I had a good heart. Jason and Mom were the ones who should feel terrible, but probably didn't. After we hung up, I sat in my kitchen and cried. Not for Jason. For the family I'd thought I had, but apparently never did. Monday morning, I walked into the office trying to focus on work instead of family drama. Laura called me into her conference room and spread out a thick file across the table. A commercial property owner needed help evicting a business tenant who'd stopped paying rent 8 months ago, but refused to leave and was now claiming the lease was invalid due to building code violations they'd caused themselves. Laura said she wanted me to handle it because I understood tenant law better than anyone else at the firm, and she trusted my judgment completely. The case was worth serious money and would put me in front of major clients. I felt something loosen in my chest, like I'd been holding my breath waiting for someone to tell me I was still good at my job despite the mess at home. 2 weeks later, the permanent restraining order hearing arrived. I showed up with all my documentation organized in labeled folders. Gerard came as my attorney even though I didn't technically need one. Jason didn't show up at all. His lawyer had quit and he apparently couldn't afford another one or didn't think it mattered anymore. The judge reviewed my evidence for maybe 10 minutes. The doorbell footage showing Jason as a guest. The text messages begging for temporary help. The fraudulent eviction notice. The fake deed filing. The threatening messages after I filed the temporary order. The judge granted a 3-year restraining order without hesitation and added a note in the court record about Jason's fraudulent deed attempt and pattern of harassment. Jason had to stay 500 feet away from me, my home and my workplace for 3 years. Violating it meant immediate arrest and criminal charges. I walked out of the courthouse feeling safer, but also strange, like I'd just made something permanent that I couldn't take back. Gerard called me 3 days later with news about the deed situation. He'd successfully gotten Jason's fake deed voided through an emergency court order. But during the title search process, something else came up. Jason had tried to take out a home equity line of credit using the fraudulent deed as collateral. He'd applied to 2 different banks claiming he owned 50% of my house and wanted to borrow against his share. One bank had denied him immediately because their title search caught the problems. The other bank had started processing the application before my emergency filing stopped it. Now both banks were pursuing criminal charges for mortgage fraud. Gerard explained that attempting to fraudulently obtain a mortgage was a felony that carried serious prison time, usually 2 to 5 years depending on the amount and circumstances. Jason had tried to borrow $80,000. I sat in my car outside Gerard's office feeling sick. This had gone so far beyond anything I'd intended when I first served him with eviction papers. I'd just wanted him out of my house. Now he was facing potential prison time. I knew he'd brought this entirely on himself by filing that fake deed and trying to steal my house, but I still felt guilty. He was family, even if he was a terrible person. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about Jason in prison and Mom blaming me forever and my stepdad caught in the middle. Requested Reds is on Spotify now. Check out link in the description or comments. The next morning, I looked up therapists who specialized in family conflict. I found Michelle Raymond, who had good reviews and availability that week. I made an appointment for Thursday afternoon. Michelle's office was small and comfortable with soft lighting and tissues on every surface. I told her everything. The garage situation. Jason's fraud attempt, the restraining order, the criminal charges, my mom's manipulation, the guilt I felt despite knowing I hadn't done anything wrong. Michelle listened without interrupting, and then asked me one question. When had I first learned that my needs didn't matter as much as keeping peace in the family? I started crying and couldn't stop for 10 minutes. Over the next few weeks, Michelle helped me understand that setting boundaries wasn't cruel, that protecting myself from someone trying to steal my house wasn't mean or vindictive, that Jason had made his own choices and earned his own consequences. She pointed out patterns I'd never noticed before, how Mom had been manipulating me since the marriage 10 years ago, how I was always the one expected to be reasonable, to compromise, to help out, how my success was treated as a resource for the family to use rather than something I'd earned, how every time I set a boundary, Mom framed it as selfishness. Michelle asked me to list times I'd been volunteered to solve family problems. I filled 2 pages. Times my own needs had been dismissed as selfish. Another 2 pages. I started recognizing the pattern in real time. 3 weeks after the restraining order, Mom sent a long email. She said she understood why I was angry. She said Jason had made mistakes, but everyone deserved forgiveness. She said she was asking me, as her daughter, to drop the lawsuit so Jason could move on with his life. The bank charges were out of my control, but I could at least stop pursuing him for damages and unpaid rent. She said holding on to anger would only hurt me in the long run. She said family was forever, and I'd regret destroying these relationships over money and pride. I read the email twice and then closed it. Michelle and I had talked about this exact scenario. Mom still wasn't acknowledging what Jason had actually done wrong. She wasn't apologizing for manipulating me into housing him. She wasn't taking any responsibility for enabling his behavior. She was just asking me to absorb more damage so Jason wouldn't have to face consequences. I didn't respond. The contractor finished repairing the garage damage in early November. The holes in the walls were patched and painted. The broken space heater was replaced with proper heating. But the contractor suggested going further and converting it into a real studio apartment with its own bathroom and kitchenette. It would cost more upfront but would add serious value to my property and let me rent it out legitimately. I agreed and watched the transformation over 3 weeks. Real walls instead of hanging sheets. A small bathroom with a shower. A kitchenette with a mini fridge and 2-burner stove. Proper insulation and climate control. It looked professional and livable. I decided to rent it out to cover the repair costs. This time I'd do everything right. Proper lease agreement, tenant screening, credit checks, references, everything I should have required from Jason but didn't because of family pressure. My first applicant was Ava DuPont, a graduate student working on her dissertation in environmental science. She needed quiet space away from roommate drama and campus noise. She had excellent references from previous landlords who said she was respectful, quiet, and always paid rent early. She had stable income from a teaching assistant position and a research grant. She read through the entire lease agreement carefully and asked smart questions about utilities and parking. Then she signed it without trying to negotiate away any terms or claim she deserved special treatment. The bar was incredibly low, but I was relieved anyway. Ava moved in on a cold Saturday in December. She had help from 2 friends, and they carried in boxes of books and lab equipment. She introduced herself properly, thanked me for the space, and asked about trash pickup schedule. That first month, she paid rent 3 days early. She kept the space clean. She didn't blast music at 3 a.m. She didn't use my kitchen or my washer and dryer without asking. She didn't tell people she co-owned my house. Having someone responsible in the garage helped me reclaim that space in my head. It wasn't Jason's disaster zone anymore. It was a legitimate rental generating income and proving I could trust my own judgment when I wasn't being manipulated by family obligation. Right before Christmas, Gerard called with an update on the bank's fraud investigation. They'd been digging into Jason's background and discovered he'd tried this exact scheme before. 3 years ago, he'd been dating a woman who let him move into her apartment temporarily. After 2 months, he tried to claim tenant rights and threatened to sue her for illegal eviction when she asked him to leave. He'd filed paperwork claiming they had a verbal lease agreement, and he'd made improvements to the property. The woman had been scared and confused and ultimately just paid him $2,000 to leave peacefully. She never pressed charges because she wanted it over with. The bank investigator had tracked her down and she agreed to provide a statement. Jason was a serial scammer who targeted people who cared about him. He found vulnerable people, moved in under false pretenses, then used legal intimidation to extract money or housing. I wasn't his first victim. I was just the first one who'd fought back hard enough to expose the whole pattern. 2 days later, Gerard called while I was making dinner. He got straight to the point. The district attorney reviewed all the evidence and wanted to prosecute Jason for the fraudulent deed filing and the attempted mortgage fraud. They had enough for multiple felony counts. Gerard said the DA needed to know if I'd cooperate as a witness and whether I wanted to push for maximum penalties or ask for leniency because of the family relationship. I told him I needed time to think about it. That night, I barely slept. Sending my stepbrother to prison felt wrong, even though I knew what he'd done was serious. The next morning, I called Michelle and asked for an emergency session. She fit me in that afternoon. I sat in her office explaining how guilty I felt about potentially destroying Jason's life. Michelle listened and then asked what would happen to the next person Jason targeted if he faced no real consequences. She reminded me about the ex-girlfriend who'd paid him $2,000 just to make him go away. That woman had been scared and alone, and Jason had exploited her fear. If he got away with it again, he'd just find another victim. Michelle helped me understand that protecting future victims wasn't cruel. It was necessary. I called Gerard back that evening and told him I'd cooperate fully with the prosecution. I'd testify if needed, and I wouldn't ask for leniency. Gerard said the DA would want a victim impact statement describing what Jason's fraud had cost me financially and emotionally. I spent the next 2 days writing it. I described the violation of trust when Jason filed that fake deed. I explained the thousands of dollars in legal fees to clear my title. I detailed the emotional damage from having my own stepbrother try to steal my house. I wrote about the bank investigation and the stress of wondering if my mortgage was compromised. I included screenshots of Jason's threatening texts and copies of his fraudulent documents. When I finished, it was 12 pages long. I sent it to the DA's office and tried to focus on work while waiting for what would happen next. 3 weeks later, Gerard called to say Jason had been arrested that morning. Multiple counts of fraud, forgery, and attempted theft by deception. The bail was set high because of the previous victim coming forward with her own statement. Jason couldn't afford it, so he'd stay in jail until trial. An hour after Gerard's call, my phone rang with Mom's number. I almost didn't answer, but some part of me needed to hear what she'd say. She started screaming before I could even say hello. I'd destroyed her family. I'd sent my own brother to jail over a misunderstanding. Jason was confused and made mistakes, but I was being cruel and vindictive. I let her rant for about 30 seconds, and then I cut her off. I told her she destroyed our relationship 10 years ago, when she married into this family, and immediately started treating me like a resource instead of a daughter. She manipulated me into housing Jason without being honest about why she really needed him out of her condo. She enabled his entitlement and his cruelty toward me for a decade. She watched him try to steal my house, and her first response was to defend him. Jason wasn't confused. He knew exactly what he was doing because he'd done it before to someone else. Mom went silent for a moment and then said, "I'd regret this." She hung up. I sat there staring at my phone, feeling weirdly calm. 2 days later, my stepdad called and asked if we could meet for coffee. He sounded tired but determined. We met at a place near my office the next morning. He looked older than I remembered, more worn down. He ordered coffee and then told me he'd filed for separation from Mom the day before. I felt my stomach drop, even though part of me wasn't surprised. He explained that Mom's refusal to hold Jason accountable had been destroying their marriage for years. Every time Jason messed up, Mom made excuses. Every time someone tried to set boundaries with Jason, Mom played the victim. My stepdad had watched it happen over and over. But watching Mom enable Jason's attack on me was the final straw. He said he was done making excuses for both of them. He apologized for not protecting me from Mom's manipulation earlier. He said he should have spoken up when Mom pressured me to take Jason in. I told him it wasn't his fault, but he shook his head. He said he'd been part of the problem by staying silent. Now he was trying to be part of the solution. I went to Michelle's office that afternoon feeling terrible about the separation. Even though my stepdad insisted it wasn't my fault, I couldn't shake the guilt. Michelle asked me to think about what would have happened if I'd just let Jason steal my house. Would that have saved my stepdad's marriage? I admitted it probably wouldn't have. Mom's enabling went way deeper than this situation. Michelle helped me understand that I didn't cause any of this. I just refused to keep absorbing the damage from other people's dysfunction. Setting boundaries revealed problems that were already there. I didn't create them. At work, things were going better than expected. The complex commercial eviction case Laura assigned me 3 months ago finally reached resolution. The tenant had been refusing to leave a retail space despite lease violations and unpaid rent. I'd built an airtight case with documentation of every violation and proper notice procedures. The judge ruled in our favor and ordered immediate eviction with full back rent payment. The client was so impressed they specifically requested me for all their future legal work. They had 12 commercial properties and steady tenant issues. Laura called me into her office after the client meeting. She said she'd been watching how I handled both professional challenges and personal crisis. She was impressed by my integrity and my ability to keep working at a high level despite everything happening with Jason. She mentioned that the firm was considering adding a junior partner position, and I should think about whether I'd be interested in that track. The partnership conversation felt surreal given everything else happening, but it also felt like validation that I'd made the right choices. 4 months after his arrest, Jason took a plea deal. Gerard called to walk me through the terms. Jason pled guilty to fraud and forgery charges. He'd get 5 years probation instead of prison time. He had to complete 200 hours of community service. He was required to attend mandatory financial counseling sessions. And he had to pay full restitution for all the damage and unpaid expenses, which totaled nearly $15,000 with legal fees included. The criminal record would follow him forever, showing up on background checks for jobs and housing. Gerard said Jason's lawyer had pushed hard for the deal because going to trial risked serious prison time. Jason took it because he had no other choice. A week after the plea deal, I got an email from Mom. The subject line was, "Final chance." I almost deleted it without reading, but curiosity won. The email said she couldn't have a relationship with me while I was punishing Jason for his mistakes. Family forgives family. I needed to choose between my pride and my family. She'd be willing to reconcile if I dropped the restitution requirement and helped Jason get back on his feet. Otherwise, she couldn't be part of my life. I read it twice and then closed my laptop. I didn't respond. Her framing showed she still didn't understand what Jason actually did. She saw it as mistakes and punishment rather than fraud and consequences. I'd already made my choice when I supported the prosecution. My stepdad and I started meeting for coffee every week, sometimes twice a week if our schedules allowed. We talked about his therapy and his divorce proceedings. He apologized repeatedly for not protecting me from mom's manipulation earlier. He said he'd been enabling her enabling, and he was trying to understand his own patterns. He seemed lighter somehow, like a weight had lifted. We developed a relationship that had nothing to do with mom or Jason. Just two people who'd survived the same dysfunctional family system and were trying to be healthier. 6 months after Jason moved out, I was actually thriving. Work was challenging but rewarding. The partnership track was looking more real every week. My house felt secure and peaceful again. Ava paid rent 3 days early every month and kept the garage space clean and quiet. We had a friendly landlord-tenant relationship built on mutual respect and clear boundaries. The rental income covered my increased mortgage payment from refinancing to remove any cloud on my title that Jason's fraud had created. I'd learned to set firm boundaries and trust my own judgment over family pressure. Michelle helped me understand that protecting myself wasn't selfish. My stepdad's friendship showed me that healthy family relationships were possible when both people took responsibility. And Jason's consequences, while severe, had probably saved his next potential victim from going through what I did. 2 months later, Gerard called asking if I'd co-present with him at a property law conference about fraudulent deed schemes. He wanted to use my case as a teaching example for other lawyers on how to protect homeowners from similar scams. I said yes immediately because turning my nightmare into professional expertise felt empowering. We spent weeks preparing the presentation, pulling together all the documentation from Jason's case, and organizing it into a clear timeline that showed how the fraud developed. Gerard handled the technical legal analysis while I focused on the practical warning signs that property lawyers should watch for. The conference was in a hotel ballroom with about 200 attorneys from across the region. I stood at the podium next to Gerard and walked through Jason's fraudulent eviction notice, his fake adverse possession claim, and the forged deed he'd filed with the county. The audience took notes and asked questions about red flags and prevention strategies. After we finished, at least a dozen lawyers came up to talk. 3 of them had clients dealing with similar situations where family members or roommates tried to claim property rights they didn't have. One attorney told me about a case where an ex-boyfriend filed a fake quitclaim deed and tried to sell his former girlfriend's condo. Another described a tenant who forged lease documents to make it look like they'd been renting for years instead of months. I realized Jason's attempt was especially stupid because he didn't even understand basic property law. But fraudulent claims were way more common than I'd thought. People try these scams all the time because they think homeowners won't fight back or won't know how to respond legally. Gerard and I exchanged contact information with several attorneys who wanted to stay in touch about these cases. The next week, Laura called me into her office. She closed the door and told me the partners had been discussing my performance over the past year. She said I'd handled the Jason situation without letting it affect my work quality, and my expertise in tenant law had brought in several major clients. Then she offered me junior partner. The promotion came with a significant raise and my own office instead of the cubicle I'd been working in. I signed the partnership agreement that afternoon and spent the rest of the week moving into my new space. My office had a window overlooking downtown and enough room for a proper desk and client meeting area. I used part of my raise to hire contractors for a complete renovation of my main house. New paint in every room, replacing the carpet Jason had stained, updating the kitchen cabinets he'd damaged. I bought new furniture that actually matched instead of the random pieces I'd collected over the years. The whole place felt different, like it was truly mine instead of the space Jason had invaded. When the renovation finished, I hosted a housewarming party and was invited colleagues from the firm, plus the few real friends I'd maintained outside of work. People brought wine and food, complimented the renovations, and nobody asked about Jason or the drama because they knew me as a successful lawyer, not someone dealing with family dysfunction. Around this same time, Jason finished his community service requirement. His probation officer contacted me to verify he'd completed the hours picking up trash along the highway and working at a food bank. He also started making restitution payments, though at $50 per month, it would take him over 20 years to repay the $15,000 he owed. The probation officer called every few months asking if I'd received the payments and if Jason had contacted me in violation of the restraining order. I answered factually without adding commentary about what Jason deserved or how I felt about the situation. My stepdad sent me a text saying Mom wanted to reconcile. He forwarded her message which said she'd been thinking about our relationship and missed having me in her life. But the whole message focused on whether I was ready to forgive, rather than acknowledging what she'd actually done wrong. She wanted me to understand that Jason had been struggling, and she'd only been trying to help family. I texted my stepdad back saying I was open to rebuilding our relationship when Mom was ready to take real accountability for manipulating me into housing Jason, and then choosing his side when he committed fraud. I added that I wasn't holding my breath because she'd shown me exactly where I ranked in her priorities. 3 months after that, my stepdad's divorce was finalized. He moved into a small 1-bedroom apartment about 15 minutes from my house. We started having dinner together every week, sometimes twice if our schedules worked out. He looked healthier and more relaxed than I'd seen him in years. He told me that not constantly managing Mom's drama and Jason's schemes had lifted a weight he didn't even realize he'd been carrying. We talked about normal things like his new hobby of woodworking and my cases at work. Sometimes we discussed the family situation, but mostly we just built a relationship that had nothing to do with Mom or Jason. A full year after Jason's eviction attempt, I sat in my renovated living room and realized I was genuinely happy. Work was challenging but rewarding. The partnership track was real. My house felt secure and peaceful. I'd learned to set firm boundaries and trust my professional judgment over family pressure. Michelle had helped me recognize manipulation patterns before they cost me, and I'd stopped feeling guilty for protecting myself. The biggest lesson was understanding that family doesn't get unlimited chances to hurt you just because you share DNA or history. That same month, Ava told me she wanted to renew her lease for another year. She'd been the perfect tenant, paying rent early every month and keeping the garage space clean and quiet. We had a friendly professional relationship built on clear expectations and mutual respect. I realized I'd successfully turned the garage from a symbol of violation into a legitimate income source. The rental money covered my higher mortgage payment and proved that the whole situation with Jason, as terrible as it was, had taught me that protecting myself wasn't selfish. It was necessary for survival. I was sitting in my home office on a Saturday morning reviewing contracts for an upcoming case when an email notification popped up. The sender was a young lawyer from a firm 2 towns over. She wrote that she had a client whose brother-in-law moved into their basement 3 months ago and was now refusing to leave while claiming tenant rights. She'd heard about my case through the property law conference presentation and wondered if I had any advice. I smiled and opened a new reply window. I started typing a detailed response about documentation requirements, the difference between guests and tenants, and how to build an airtight case for removal. I explained the importance of security footage, text messages, and social media posts that proved the person's actual status. I told her about common fraudulent claims and how to counter them before they escalated. Writing that email felt like closing a circle, using my nightmare experience to help someone else avoid the same trap Jason had set for me. That's how it went down from my side. What about you? Leave your version in the comments. I always love seeing how differently everyone sees it.